We're going to do some arms here. So we're going to step away from doing our little meat spears, our meat blobs, and instead do something now that we're a little more familiar with. But we wanted to start abstractly because I didn't want you to get caught up in questioning anatomy or any straight up concerns of meeting requirements of something looking correct or anything of the sort. And I still don't want you to do that. We're going to use this. I'm going to draw some pretty skewed transformed anatomy here. And then that will allow us to assess these shapes, which will be anatomical. By doing it very skewed, we won't get caught up in proportion and what's actually right. We're just going to assess what would make them look good with volume and shading. So I am drawing here exactly with the same things in mind as our exercise doing the meatballs, the meat spears, the tentacles, whatever the heck those things were. We were doing the same thing. So all I'm doing is drawing dynamic, flowing shapes that interlock in interesting ways. Now, this is a shading tutorial, so I am not talking about how the way that these shapes are interlocking is based on anatomical knowledge, right? That's sort of a separate discussion. But what you need to know, all that's relevant here is that they are flowing, they have some movement, and that they interlock. And their interlocking of anatomical shapes is quite subtle. And it demands that you understand the variety in soft and hard edges, that you understand the difference in flat planes and round planes and how to depict them. But the interesting thing about rendering is that all of the beauty, all of the nicety of a natural form is still just occurring within that language, within that context. No matter how characteristic, no matter how unusual, no matter how beautiful or sublime, anything, it can always be understood in terms of the hard and soft edges, the roundness versus the flatness, and the design of those shadow shapes. That doesn't mean you will exactly understand it, but someone with perfect knowledge about those interactions would be able to understand it. Okay, so let's look at this bent arm here, and let's pretend that the light is coming from top left. Let's just scribble on this arm real quick. I'm gonna try to not get caught up just rendering this arm. We're gonna plot shadow shapes on a few arms, and then we'll see if we pick some to completely render. But the shadow shapes are really what's important here. So we can say that where this deltoid inserts into the bicep, we're going to get a nice dramatic shadow shape there. Do a little triangular shape to imply a secondary shadow. And then this thicker one is going to cast a cast shadow this way that I'm going to drag all the way over the bicep. Let this area under the pec become shadow. And then let's get a nasty vein coming out of there, which is going to give us a reason to punch in slightly to that cleanly delineated shadow. Let's extend it this way. Then you don't want the veins to get too dark. I'm hatching away from the edge of the vein so that I don't delineate it too sharp on the other side, but you can still tell what the shape is. Let me indicate my long roll out of the core shadow slightly by getting longer hatching. Getting some skin folds there, which will have little U-shaped or V-shaped tight shadows in between them. And I'm getting a little variety into that shadow shape to imply that there's reflected light. Now that's a subtle thing to do, but you understand the base concepts now. So you should be able to see that when I wanted to get a little bit of reflected light to thicken up this peck's shadow over here, because the peck has thickness to it where it rolls underneath, I just left a space and then I got a dark accent on the other side of it. Okay. Let's get a bit of a triangular shadow for the infraclavicular fossa there. The space between the pecs and this head of the deltoid. Let's roll back down here. So the light is coming in this way, this way, this way. So if we imagine our tangent points, we're going to get some pretty serious shadows down around here, right? So I don't need to map it perfectly. I don't need to have a perfect conception of that three-dimensional shape of that complex bicep and brachialis medius. Bicep, the brachialis and the brachioradialis happening over here. Like I don't need to understand them perfectly, but I just need a general conception of, oh, they're going to be grays somewhere here is really where it's going to be. And that because they're so close to turning completely away from the light, we're going to get some pretty soft gradations in this area, right? So let's drop our hatching in to indicate that fall off. And then let's pick some spots down here to get some true shadow. You can have it poke up into that wrinkle there. And then let's have this part of the forearm catch light again. And then let's plunge a lot of this forearm into shadow. Trying to design some interesting shapes there around the wrist. Looking for a little more asymmetry from one side of the forearm to the other. That bulge that I had there was basically exactly symmetrical with what was going on the other side of the arm. Fighting for my gesture, which I'm losing by making that edit. Always a compromise. So I'm trying not to overthink too much here. I'm just following the direction of, I'm letting the direction of the light tell me where there should be more and less shadow. And honestly, more than imagining something like our schematics where we were mapping the core shadow, I'm hunting for interesting shapes. I think 9 times out of 10, a accurate boring shape is worse than a inaccurate cool shape. Many a beautiful and accurate drawing has been done that has gone over like a math lecture. And many mediocre drawings have been done that focused on the cool that changed people's lives. Now the hand asks us to consider some interesting things. So the hand has sort of a dip down from the wrist. If this is your wrist, there's a bit of like a rounded hemisphere shape, and then the rest of the hand kind of continues off that way. It's always doing this stair-stepping effect. So we could look for a shadow on that hemisphere there. Use it to break up that flat plane on the back of the hand. And then move the shapes of the bones and tendons in and around that plane break. As we move away from the light, shadow shapes get bigger. And then if I'm going to put any indications of shadow shapes up here in the light, they're definitely smaller. If you're doing a drawing and the idea of relegating them by size does not work for that drawing, you can always just, they could be the same size, but as long as they're the ones that are closer to the light are much lighter, that'll work too. And it'll really help to imply the light if both are happening. So you can see this is not the easiest scale to work a hand, but when I'm doing the fingers, I'm doing the same thing. So I'm following the direction of the light, so I know the shadows are going to be in the bottom, and I'm just waggling interesting shapes. Did I think a lot about anatomy there? Not much. You know where the knuckles go. I mean, that finger's all bent up, but the waggly shapes really do a lot. And you have to be tasteful when you use a lot of waggly shapes as the basis for your invention, right? They can go pretty far, but you've got to take your opportunities to also reel them in, or else everything gets too waggly. So I'm cutting into these shadow shapes, finding a little variety in there, kind of like we did on that first exercise. So making a little pop out so that there's a form under there that's just has a little bit of light, but it's mostly shadow. We're following all those same principles. And then a good thing on an arm is you can let veins do a lot of that work for you. Just always be careful not to overstate them. In this comic booky stage of this drawing, it's a little okay that they get overstated. And, this is clearly like a beast arm with its over definition, its scary fingers, and the way the hand is like bent all weird. So when you imply stuff like that, you can get away with a little more in vein territory and overstating things. The veins really become opportunities to break up those shapes. Having a vein transition over the wrist there. And then I will put it feels like the bicep is not defined enough, so I'm going to put sort of characteristic sickle-shaped shadow shape under the bicep. Now, again, like I said, how do I know what shapes will work for these particular parts of the anatomy? Well, that's just from knowing the anatomy. The anatomy is what gives you, anatomy and exposure are what give you some knowledge of what shapes will work for what problem you're trying to solve. You have an intimate understanding of what the deltoid looks like, you're going to make a pretty good guess of what shadow shape would work for the deltoid in that lighting. You know, if you had a life model, you'd probably be able to arrive at a better shadow shape, one that's even more characteristic, more impossible to imagine. But your guess will at least be functional, if not sublime. All right, so that's one arm. So we're not going to go in and render there, but really from the other demos, you guys get the idea. You lay in the shadow shape versus the light shape, and you can see that in certain parts I've already indicated with my hatching what the roll varieties might be like here. These spots are going to have long, soft gradations out of their cast shadow, and then spots like this are going to have super tight, short gradations out of their cast shadow. And then that variety is going to explain the form and give us interest. All right, let's do some other vaguely anatomical thing here. So, interlocking, interesting shapes. I do not have much of a plan here. I am just looking for these shapes to do something together, to interact. So you can see, once I know a thrust I'm going to follow, I break it up with those teardrop shapes, find reasons to have things interlock, like right there. Often sketching, be careful if you sketch like bubble-like forms like that. What I'm doing there is indicating possible interesting subforms, but you don't want to make those your primary forms because you will tend to, they will just become bubbles on the surface and look odd. You want those to be very low contrast as you render them. So let's see, it would have been nice if I had brought that back tighter, so sort of going in perspective, but I did not apply it super effectively. Say form goes off that way. So this is like a back view of a strange distorted arm, some weird webbing back here. So you know where this is going. Since this is a little bigger, I'm going to take out a wooden pencil, so because it'll just leave thicker lines to cover more ground. And let's just now, I'm not afraid, or I'm trying not to be afraid, of just making some pretty characteristic geometric shadow shapes here. So you can see this part went more square, this part's more hooky, this one made like a long triangle. on my good days, I remember to do that. Because the truth is that as you render things, everything becomes stepped on, right? Like every good thing that you've gone for always gets diminished as you render and develop things. Who knows why? I actually can't figure out. I wonder about it. It doesn't make sense that it doesn't, stuff doesn't hold up, but it just doesn't. And so you generally want to start more curvy than you plan on ending. You want to start a little darker than you plan on getting. You want to start a little more geometric, and you just want to make a stronger statement in the beginning about the shapes of things than you even plan to have it end up as, because if you start like this, you have some chance in hell of some version of this shape being maintained to the end. But if you start very blobby and nondescript with your shapes that you put down, they will only get more blobby and nondescript, and then they will lose all of their structure and all of the impact that they could have given you. So, wow, weird comma shape there. I am not thinking any of this through. I am just vaguely following the bubbles that I put down, and I'm trying to not do the same shape twice. That is it. So much of it really does just come down to that, because the tendency truly, and this is quite amazing once you start noticing it in yourself, is to just do the same shape every time. It's like not even like every third or fourth shape. It's just like you will do the exact same shape at the exact same size with the exact same proportions every damn time. So just try to not do the same shape twice when you are slugging this stuff in, you know? Little striation here. When you do striations like skin folds, make sure that you give them variety too. A bigger gap between them, a smaller gap between them, a very big gap between them. You know, vary it up. Small, medium, large. So you can see what I did there. All of that stuff that I had, like the webbing down here that I'd had under here, I'm making a statement that, okay, actually this point on this muscle here, which looks like some sort of distorted version of a teres major, this is actually the widest point on the back, like the thickest. And if the light is coming from top, then everything under it is going to be in its shadow. And then as it gets further away, this is something that happens with cast shadows, is that as they get further away from their light source, they get softer edges. And that is actually because of the effect that we saw on the soft light box that we did a diagram for at the beginning of this tutorial, where the different parts of the subject are like, if the light is wide enough, they're sort of getting light bouncing in from more edges. As the cast shadow moves away, it's just getting exposed to more ambient environmental light, filling it in, and then softening where areas that are dipping into it are actually going dark. You can see that effect in a really cool way when you are out in nature. If you look at like the shadow of tree branches on the ground and you see a cloud shadow sort of passing over them, you get this really cool effect where you see the crisp shadows of the tree branches or the shrub branches, something short enough. sort of blending in and morphing into the soft edges of the passing cloud, which is much further away. So we don't have to draw the whole creature there, but some bold cast shadow choice. And we're breaking up those forms somehow. That got a little dark for the open light. Darker than I like. And then this is the tricep, so let's just imply some sort of value change here for brachialis underneath the biceps, right before brachioradialis. And let's imply our long hatching, or use our long hatching to imply a soft roll as this head of the deltoid inserts and turns quite a bit away from the light, if we imagine the light coming from top left, right? On good paper, even pretty dark lines can get erased really quick. And if you ever need to really erase something, you can actually just sit here like watch some Netflix and just rub for a really long time. And eventually you will just wear down the paper enough that the thing that you did will completely disappear. Or you can scrape it with a knife very carefully and get back to the white of the paper a lot of the times. But you have to be careful if you do that, because then it will show if you draw over it again. So if you're going to scrape with a knife, use it to get a highlight when you know you're done with the area. So with shadow shapes like that kind of mapped, I'm going to show you what happens if you don't hatch out first. Just going to try to press hard, soften a lot of that. I'm going to draw following the shapes of those bulges that I indicated. Whenever I pick up some value on the tip of the stump from what I've been rubbing down, I'll pass it around a little bit on the form and go back to beating that up. Take the stump and put it, when I'm trying to get a soft edge, I'll put the tip in towards the core shadow so that the soft back of the stump kind of rolls away towards the light. It helps you get a bit of a softer edge. You got to be careful though, because then you can't really tell where it's going to wind up, so it can get longer than you want. But you can see the effect that I got from it there. It helped me soften up that hard edge on the value gradient. So I wanted to show this to show that it is very difficult to transition out of that core shadow without doing a little bit of hatching work first. So it's possible if you press really hard, but it's usually much easier if you've done a little bit of handwork before you stump. It just helps it blend much better. But I will show this to demonstrate that, you know, some people like this look where it kind of, because it maintains sort of the graphic quality of the way that you demarcated the shadow shape. So you might be into this. This area is getting a little confused because you can't quite tell here what is light and what is shadow. So let me just darken around where I imagine the light to go. Just a little triangular tail there. Let's push up out from this tip of the deltoid up into the belly. So that's giving us a nice, so you see when you put a little hatching down first, that generally makes your blending look a little better. So I'll show you. So on a sharp one like this, I would probably blend with the direction of the shape, or a hatch with the direction of the thrust like this, to give me a base to stump. But you can also go counter to the shape. So, you know, here, for example, instead of going like that, following the shape of the core shadow, I can cross hatch out of it, which normally I would turn just the way I like to draw, I would turn my paper upside down to do this. But since I'm on camera and I don't want to throw my setup into disarray here, I'm just going to draw not the way I usually do. I usually pull hatching down towards me. And right now I'm having to push it out, and that's not usually how I draw. But everyone has a different preference for that. So yeah, you can instead sort of hatch out of your cast shadows in that way. And they give slightly different effects. Both can be softened quite effectively and help the core shadow kind of blend into the halftones. But this one generally leaves you with a slightly more textured look than this. So they're good for different situations. Here I go, pressing real hard again. Right now, I'm going to show you if I can get the hatching to disappear completely by pressing basically as hard as I can. And for the most part, yeah, you can just barely see it. But it also obliterated that nice hooky shape that I had on that subform on Teres Major, and it got a little too dark. So stuff to consider. So I'm tapping, since it got too dark and it also left a hard edge, I'm tapping with the kneaded eraser to get a mottled edge back. Mottled like M-O-T-T-L-E-D, just like dither. It's kind of random. It's not necessarily soft. It's very hard to erase back a true soft edge. True soft edges are got by drawing them, you know, by carefully gradating them. With the eraser, really the best you can do is kind of mottled, kind of dirty. So it doesn't get truly soft, but you can at least kind of break up a hard edge. And let's prep some of these spaces with hatching. This pencil is probably a little light to be doing this hatching with because we're dipping into a pretty severe halftone there. That's no good. Let me get another pencil. Just because the strokes that were going down were way too like fine compared to some of these bold I'm rushing strokes that I put in there. I'm putting down wider hatching there to imply kind of a flatter plane. All right, let's beat some of this stuff up. We can add a little more subtle cross hatching on this ball, this bulbous guy, to prep him for stumping. We can go all the way around the form for this odd alien trapezius here. So I'm trying to set up the difference for you guys of what it looks like when you don't hatch before you come out of the core shadows that you delineate, and how it looks a little more, to me, it comes out a little more gradated looking if you do a little drawing work first. It just makes the stumping hold together so much better. You see that? I think so. So I'm darkening the nose of that little form there because it's like the light is coming slightly from top left, right? So this part of that bulb, of that bulge, would get a little more light than that nose of it that's inserting there. So I'm just ever so lightly indicating that. Again, that is definitely stuff I want to keep low contrast because it's all subforms on this big deltoid shape. You know, I'm actually creating a classic problem here. Great. So this subform, right, the value change on this subform that I indicated happening at its tip for that little nicety of light, it blew the contrast on the deltoid because that is as dark as down here where the deltoid inserts, which we can see is really far away from the light. So we must reassess the lighting completely. So all that needs is a true shadow area down here somewhere to put it back into place in the contrast hierarchy. Wow. And that's an example of the kind of problem solving you will need to do to control your shading in situations like this. And then that brings the multiplying villainies of nature now swarm upon us, because since this is a true shadow shape here now, which could be more carefully considered, that means that it'll cast shadow down onto this plane somehow. So we got to extend it. And then it sets new expectations, right? So I don't think we need to like put a shadow nose kind of a thing on these forms, because this is really like it's dipping down and these are more going out, you know? So I think that these planes are pretty different from these down planes, but it's pretty close to resetting our expectations and making us have to restructure those shadow shapes. I'll definitely gradate this bicep that's happening on the other side of the arm. And let's pull that shadow out. Well, let me, all right, I'll turn the paper slightly. Just gonna gradate out. With some hatching. And it's probably not going to be ideal, but well. Soften. Like that. And then we will clean our edge. And then let's take our kneaded eraser. Drop a little lighting variety in here. Just a twinge. Oh my, just a twinge. I don't know what I was thinking these little guys were. It's a beast, so it's got like some horns. So I'm just trying to imply a slight local value shift. It's like as these protrusions come out of his body, they get darker. And then we can put a little blip, make them gross by giving them a shiny tip. Looks kind of pimply, right? And then let's press hard and follow the form on this trapezius. Let me try to get you a better view of that on camera. So I'm broadsiding the stump and I'm just going around. I'm still pressing quite hard as I go out. And I'm just following that three-dimensional form that I indicated with the stump. I'm going pretty broad here because I want these planes to read as different from that bulge there to go kind of flat. Now it went a little dark on me. I was trying to exaggerate so that all that blurriness showed up kind of crisp on camera, and it went a little too dark, but this is all pretty soft, so it's easy to lighten this up. It's easy to lighten this up with the kneaded eraser. So I'm just tapping, tapping, tapping. You can see mottled, that's what we get, but lightened. And then this one we could actually leave kind of dark. We just really need to lighten these top planes of the trapezius. Generally, dragging the kneaded eraser like that is not the best over long distances, but it's working out okay right now. Usually it's better to, like, you know, you can get little pulls at like that size, but then once you start dragging the kneaded eraser, it doesn't hurt the drawing. What it does, it can lead to the kneaded eraser can leave some of its gumminess behind. It'll like leave little flecks of kneaded eraser smeared in that are actually very hard to remove, can be visible, and then they are a pain to draw over. So they can really kind of ruin that spot on the paper for you. So just be careful if you're going to do pulls that long with the kneaded eraser. All right, so yeah, just a little lighter helps bring that more into place. And let's work some of these shapes and interactions so that they're actually something instead of a lumpy nada. You know, if you're doing this in pencil, you need to be really patient, you know, like the demos that I'm doing here, there's only so far I can go in a reasonable amount of time while I'm demonstrating with pencil, you know. Pencil really demands patience and going back and forth and doing a lot of layering. And correcting contrast mistakes as you go. I'm really going for like the punch on the first pass just so that I can make the point for the demonstration so that you can understand the concepts. But when I draw for myself, I do each one of these steps much more slowly. And I try to set them up with a better chance of succeeding. I sketch pretty fast, and I pass the shadow shapes over the drawing as I sketch. But each one of these steps, like, doing the stumping, hatching out of my shadows, I give each one of those, or I try to give them much more time. And I try to look for something new in them each time that I do them. Like I try to find a moment in the hatching out of the shadows where I find something exciting. And then I feel good once I found something that I haven't quite gotten before in a drawing. And then when I start stumping out of all of that, I try to find something new just in the stumping, some interesting gradient of values that I didn't expect was going to get into the drawing. I'm always looking for that at every step, That's usually the drawings that go best are the ones that have a lot of unexpected things happening in them for me. And I think the reason for that is that if something unexpected and interesting has happened at each step, then that just gives me a lot more energy to want to finish it and to care for it and to want to go further with it. So inevitably, those will wind up being the best drawings, right? Breaking up these shapes a little bit with some weird interactions because I got too high contrast here on this transition, I think. I put it in really dark. I don't even remember why I did that, but some sort of weird value interactions here. Trying to get those two bubbly shapes to sort of interlock, right? Which they're starting to do. I'm trying to pass these values on the scapular muscles, trying to get them to be kind of flat and subtle while still leaving enough room to look for some interesting interactions. I just don't want them to pop off as much as the sort of teres major shape here. Flat this slightly. Again, another area where if I was working just on one of my own drawings that I would take my time on, I would darken a big patch like this further by hand before stumping it. I would stump it at some point, but I would get it darker by hand first. I'm really just stumping the first pass on that shadow here. So it's always going to be pretty unsatisfactory. So now I'm just going to imply some reflected light just the way that we have in previous diagrams by darkening what's under the reflected light instead of taking an eraser to the reflected light for now. Which is a very useful technique, and you can get some great, I love doing it, you can get some great drawing ideas by pulling shapes around in those shadows, but truly, you want to save that for later once you have a better grip on this stuff, because you'll almost always leave it too light, especially if you find a shape with the kneaded eraser that you like, because then you will be loath to erase it. Loath to darken it, and it'll just stay too light for the shadow. So you can see that's really broadening our value range, having that indication of reflected light going on. Tends to give a more natural feeling to a lot of these moments. And let's just, in this area where we tried to show how different the stumping effects come out when you just go straight over your core shadow or when you hatch first, let's just modulate that a bit. So I'm hatching out of that dark area. That's generally what I do. I almost always will hatch out of the dark area towards my lights. I don't usually cross hatch, but I feel like doing it right now for some reason. I usually just go in one direction since I'm going to stump it anyway. And then I'll drag the stump through the light to get some subforms. That's a little too dark. But it makes them also look much more beastly if it has little striations and subforms like that. Right down the middle of that to give it a little. Let's see if that worked. Nope, not at all. That looks dumb. Let's erase that out. Can go for that striation again, but more low contrast, please. Let's darken this insertion of the lateral head of the tricep. If we can even call it that with how distorted this monster arm is. And let me, since I'm not gonna get into all these weeds out here, let's just pass a general tone over some of this to get a fall off of light. And then we can take our kneaded eraser and look for some interesting moments here. get in those valleys like we talked about. Applying some low contrast striations there. Don't want to overdo it on the soft shapes. Those soft shapes will very quickly make the viewer think your whole drawing looks soft. Your whole drawing looks soft. It's soft, man. And we're gonna hatch out of that. A little more. And there you go. So you can imagine a spot like this sets up your contrast hierarchy, aka your contrast priorities. And then you can react to this and follow this same schema all through a rest of a body going on here and get to a render that feels very formy. And given enough time and careful regulation of the contrast hierarchy, will feel formy and hopefully hold together. You know, things can get very formy, but sort of fall apart as drawings. That's always tough. So there you go. That is how I think through some very organic forms like this when I have no reference, right? So you heard my whole like inner monologue as I was going there. None of it was, you know, obviously it's not reference based. I don't have a reference, but that means that it's not really, I'm not making my decisions based on whether something is correct or incorrect anatomy, right? All of the decisions that I were making were just design. Does it fit the contrast hierarchy? Is the shape interesting enough? Is there a variety in the edges? If this is all, you know, form shadows that are kind of hugging one side of the silhouette, can I find somewhere to set that off by designing a big cast shadow, which really adds a lot of variety to the situation? That flavor of inner monologue, that is the draftsman decision making. That is draftsmanship. That is the quality of your thinking when it comes to the choices you are making when editing, adding, removing things to your drawing, right? That's not like first blush, is the gesture curvy enough? Do I know enough anatomy to take a guess at this tricep here? They're different things. This is more design based. It's decision making based. It's problem solving based. And because it's problem solving based, it's also self-diagnostic. It's about having enough awareness of what you're doing in a drawing to sort of know what you're missing, know where it's likely that you're going wrong, know where you're not paying enough attention. A lot of that comes from benchmarking off of what you see in life, right? If you get very acute and intimate with the way the world actually works, that is one of the best benchmarks, because the world is full of variety and basically an infinite palette of things to choose from. And then if you can just recall that in your head and remember that benchmark of quality and detail, that will always help remind you that your drawing is horribly lacking, and then hopefully you'll work harder on it. But that's also not the only way. You can also look at enough great art that you will remember a benchmark from that. You will just have so carefully internalized and adored and loved the art that you really like that you can kind of gain a benchmark from that says, oh, well, you know, the art that I really love, the best art that I've seen is much more complex than that, much more sophisticated than that. It generally has more careful drawing, a bigger variety of edges, more unexpected moments, and that can be your benchmark too. Of course, somewhere down the line, the artists that you are referencing, they have found it, well, one of them, more than one of them most likely, is their personal benchmark is coming from life anyway. So you're kind of like, you're still getting it from life, but secondhand. But benchmarks are everywhere out in the world, but you really just want to know what you're missing out on, not in detail, but at least know the level that it could be at to sort of motivate you to seek great design decisions in your drawing. All right, let's move on.